I came home from a 4-day business trip, and my wife's entire family had moved into my house. Not visited, moved in. Her mother was in my bedroom watching television on my television with my remote control adjusted to her preferred volume, which was loud enough to hear from the driveway. Her sister and her sister's husband were in the guest room. Her teenage nephew was in my home office, which he had apparently converted into a gaming setup using my desk and my Wi-Fi, with 3 bags of clothes on the floor beside my filing cabinet. Her younger brother was on my couch. With his shoes on. The kitchen looked like a catering company had unpacked in it. My refrigerator had been completely restocked with things I did not buy, and things I did not eat, and several dishes covered in plastic wrap that I did not recognize. Every cabinet was reorganized. The spice rack my wife and I had arranged together over 3 years of cooking Sunday dinners was completely rearranged into a system that made sense to someone who was not me. My wife was in the kitchen. She said, "Surprise, my family decided to come visit." She said it with the specific brightness of someone who had decided in advance that enthusiasm was the correct register for this information. I said, "How long is the visit?" She said, "They are thinking maybe a few weeks. Mom needs a break from her house and Linda and Robert have some things to sort out and Darnell just needed a change of scenery." I said, "A few weeks." She said, "Maybe a month, it depends." I said, "On what?" She said, "On how things develop." I put my bag down on the hallway floor. I looked at the living room. Her mother had muted the television when I came in and was looking at me with the expression of someone who had already claimed their territory and was watching to see if anyone was going to contest it. Her brother Darnell raised one hand from the couch without getting up. He said, "Hey, Rich." I said, "Hey, Darnell." I went to the bedroom. My wife's mother had rearranged the decorative pillows. I sat on the edge of the bed. I thought for a while, and then I made a decision. Not in anger, not impulsively, methodically. I packed a small bag, enough for 3 or 4 days. I went back downstairs. I told my wife I had some things to sort out for work and would be staying near the office for a few days. She said, "Oh, okay." I said, "I will call you tomorrow." She said, "Should I save you some dinner?" I said, "I am fine." I got in my car. I drove to the Marriott on Commerce Street. I checked in. I ordered room service. And then I made 2 calls. The first was to my wife. The second was to a fumigation company. The second call was the one that produced the specific image of 5 adults in pajamas standing on my front lawn at 7:30 on a Thursday morning. Before I tell you what the fumigation company was actually for, what my wife said when I told her, and what the following 2 weeks produced in terms of a renegotiation of what my marriage actually looked like on the inside, I need to tell you where I came from, and why a man who had spent 19 years building something came home to find it occupied by people who had not asked permission. Like this video right now, subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. Comment below, when I said I called the fumigation company, what did you think I had done? Let us start from the beginning. My name is Richard Okafor, and I am 53 years old. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, the second son of Nigerian parents who had come to the United States in 1971 with 2 suitcases and a combined $400, and who had produced, through 35 years of sustained deliberate effort, a life that was the specific kind of American story that gets told at graduations, and that was built, in the actual daily reality of it, through choices that were so consistent and so patient that the choices themselves became invisible. My father, Emmanuel Okafor, worked as a hospital lab technician for 27 years. He had come with a biochemistry degree from the University of Lagos, that required additional certification to work in American hospitals, and he had gotten the certification while working as a janitor in the same hospital, where he would eventually be a senior lab technician. He had never once, in my hearing, complained about the gap between where he started and where he was supposed to have started given his education. He said once, "The work you do while you are waiting to do the work you came to do is not wasted work. It is the work that teaches you what the real work costs." I thought about that sentence for 30 years before I fully understood it. My mother, Grace, had a degree in education from Ibadan and had retrained as a licensed practical nurse in her second year in America. She worked night shifts at a hospital in Richmond for 22 years while raising 2 boys and maintaining a household with the specific organized efficiency of a woman who had decided that chaos was a luxury she could not afford. She did not believe in disorder. Not moral disorder, physical disorder, the disorder of a house that was not clean, a schedule that was not followed, a meal that was not at the table at the agreed time. These things were to her the visible evidence of internal disorganization, and she had no patience for them. I absorbed this. My brother David was 3 years older and had gone into medicine, which pleased our parents in a specific way that was not about status, but about continuity. The continuity of people who had come from a medical background building something medical in the new place. I had gone in a different direction. Engineering, Virginia Tech, 5 years with a co-op program that put me in real facilities during the academic year alongside the classroom work. I came out in 1994 with a degree in industrial engineering and a practical understanding of how manufacturing and logistics operations actually functioned that was broader than most entry-level people had. I worked for 7 years in process engineering at 2 different manufacturing companies in the Virginia-North Carolina corridor. Good work, real work, the kind where the result of what you did was visible and measurable and either worked or did not work, which was the kind of feedback environment I was built for. In 2001, at 30 years old, I started consulting. Not because I had a grand plan for a consulting firm. Because a former colleague called me about a project and the project led to another, and within 6 months, I had 3 clients and a workload that exceeded what I could manage on the side and a decision to make. I made the decision. I registered Acafer Process Solutions as an LLC, and I moved from an employee to a principal, and I did the thing that my father had done when he arrived from Lagos with $400. I started where I was and built forward. The first 3 years were lean in the specific way that consulting businesses were lean before the reputation compound. You were doing work for clients who paid you at the end of the project, and you had costs that continued regardless of whether the project was going well, and the gap between those 2 realities was managed by keeping expenses minimal and by never promising a client something you could not deliver. I did not promise things I could not deliver. My father had said, "Your word travels faster than your invoice. Protect the word first." I protected the word. By year 5, Acafer Process Solutions had 6 regular clients across North Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia, and I had moved from my apartment office to actual office space in Raleigh, and I had 2 employees, and the thing that I had built had started to feel real in a way that was different from the feeling of building it. I met my wife in year 6. Her name was Sandra Williams. She was 40 at the time. She worked in healthcare administration. She was the daughter of a woman named Loretta Williams who was, it became clear over time, the gravitational center of everything in the Williams family. I want to be honest about this, because the story requires honesty about it. I knew from early in our relationship that Sandra's family dynamic was complicated in the specific way of families, where one person had been the emotional and practical center for so long that everyone else had organized their lives around her preferences. Loretta Williams was that person. She was warm and she was genuinely kind, and she had raised 3 children on her own after her husband left when the youngest was 7, and she had done it well in the sense that all 3 children were functional adults who loved her deeply. She had also, in the raising of them, become the person they turned to first for every difficulty, the clearinghouse for every problem, the automatic first responder to every situation that required a response. And the children, now adults, had extended that arrangement into their adult lives without fully examining whether it was still appropriate. Sandra was the middle child. Her older sister, Linda, had married a man named Robert who was decent, but financially unpredictable in the way of people who were always between one thing and the next. Her younger brother, Darnell, was 36 and had been between things consistently since his mid-20s. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had not yet found the structure that made his actual abilities visible. The nephew, Darnell's son Jalen, was 16 and was the specific kind of teenager who was not malicious, but who filled whatever space was available to him, because nobody had consistently defined what the available space was. I had known all of this when I married Sandra. I had talked to her about it directly before the wedding. I had said, "I want to understand how your family works, because when we have a household together, I want us to be clear about what our household is and what it is not." She had said, "What do you mean?" I had said, "Your family is close, and I think that is genuinely good. I also want our home to be our home, a place where the two of us are the decision makers about what happens in it." She had said, "Of course, that is not even a question." I had said, "I want to make sure it is not a question when a situation arises, not just when everything is calm." She had said, "Richard, I hear you. Our home is our home." I had believed her. I had been right that she meant it in the moment. I had been wrong that the moment she meant it was the same as the moment something was needed. The first 6 years of our marriage were good. Genuinely good. We had a life together that was built on real things, shared work ethic, honest communication, a house in North Raleigh that we bought together in 2014, and that we maintained together in the way of two people who both understood that a home required consistent investment of time and attention. Sandra worked hard. She was a genuinely capable healthcare administrator who had risen to a director role at a hospital system in Raleigh, and who carried that role with the specific discipline she brought to everything. We had no children. This was a decision we had made carefully and together early in the marriage. We had talked about it with the thoroughness that important decisions deserved, and we had arrived at the same place. Our life, as it was, made sense to both of us, and the structure of what we had built together did not need to change to be complete. This was our understanding. The Williams family had a different understanding. Not stated, implied. The specific implication of a family whose default was that more people in the situation was always better than fewer people in the situation. Loretta came to visit 4 times a year. The visits were welcome. She was good company, and she brought a specific warmth to the house that I genuinely appreciated. She cooked things that filled the kitchen with smells that made the house feel different, and she talked to me with the directness that I respected, because it was closer to my own family's way of communicating. The visits were scheduled. That was the arrangement. Linda and Robert visited twice a year. Darnell visited occasionally. Jalen came with whoever brought him. All of this was manageable because it was bounded. There was a beginning and an end. There was a guest room, and a guest room meant someone was passing through. What I had not fully prepared for, despite the conversation before the wedding, was the creep. The creep was the specific phenomenon where the boundaries moved slightly each visit, and the slightly was never large enough to create a clear incident, but was consistent enough that, over 6 years, the position of the boundary had shifted considerably. Loretta staying an extra week because she was comfortable. Linda and Robert extending a visit because Robert had a job lead in the area, and it made sense to stay. Darnell sleeping on the couch for 3 days on his way from somewhere to somewhere else. Each instance was reasonable. The cumulative position was not. I had raised this with Sandra 4 times in 6 years. Each conversation had followed the same arc. I raised the specific instance. She acknowledged it. She said she understood what I was saying. She said she would talk to her family about expectations. The expectations remained unchanged. Because what Sandra could not do, in the specific dynamic she had grown up in, was draw a line that her mother would feel as a rejection. The conversation she had with her family was always in the register of suggestion rather than boundary. Suggestion was something the Williams family could receive graciously and then not change their behavior around. Boundary was something Sandra had not yet been able to produce with them. And I had not pushed hard enough on this specific failure because the cumulative position had moved slowly enough that each individual instance seemed manageable. Until I came home from 4 days in Atlanta to find the house occupied. At the hotel, I called Sandra at 9:30 that evening. She answered on the second ring. She said, "Are you settled in?" I said, "Yes, I want to talk." She said, "Okay." I said, "Sandra, when did you know they were coming?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Mom called about 10 days ago." I said, 10 days ago. She said, "Yes." I said, "And you said yes without telling me." She said, "I was going to tell you." I said, "You had 4 days while I was in Atlanta." She said, "I know. I thought it was better to tell you in person." I said, "It is better to tell me in time to participate in the decision. You agreed they could come to our house for a month without asking me." She said, "Richard." I said, "Sandra, do you understand what happened?" She said, "It got a little out of hand." I said, "Your mother is in our bedroom." She said, "She gets bad knees on the softer mattress, and our mattress is better for her back." I said, "Your mother is in our bedroom." She was quiet. I said, "I want to tell you what I am going to do, and I want you to understand why." She said, "Okay." I said, "I am staying at the hotel for the next few days, not because I am angry, though I am also angry, because I need the house to operate differently, and the only way to produce that is to not be in it for a few days." She said, "You are leaving me with them." I said, "You invited them. And Sandra, this is the specific consequence of the arrangement you created without telling me. I am not punishing you. I am letting you experience what you set up." She said, "That is not fair." I said, "I think it is very fair. You made a decision about our house without consulting me. I am making a decision about my presence without consulting you. Those are the same kind of decision." She said nothing for a moment. She said, "What about the fumigation?" I said, "What about it?" She said, "You called someone tonight. I heard a message on the house phone." I said, "I scheduled a fumigation." She said, "We do not have a pest problem." I said, "We have a scheduled annual treatment. I moved it forward." She said, "Richard." I said, "The fumigation company comes Thursday morning at 7. The house needs to be vacated by 6:45. Standard procedure. The treatment takes 4 hours." She said, "You are doing this on purpose." I said, "I am doing the annual fumigation that we do every year. The timing is the timing." She said, "Where are they supposed to go for 4 hours?" I said, "Wherever people go when their house is being treated. That is not my logistical problem to solve." She said, "This is not funny." I said, "I agree. None of this is funny. What is funny is the image of it, and I will acknowledge that." She said, "Richard." I said, "Sandra, I want to have a real conversation about this. Not tonight. In a few days when the immediate situation has run its course." She said, the immediate situation being my family. I said, the immediate situation being an arrangement you made without me for people to live in our home for a month. She said, they are not going to leave because of a fumigation. I said, I know. The fumigation is not designed to make them leave. It is designed to demonstrate that this house has schedules and processes that apply regardless of who is in it. It is the opening statement of a different conversation. She said, what conversation? I said, Thursday, after the fumigation. I will come home Thursday afternoon and we will talk about what the arrangement actually is going forward. She said, and if I do not like what you propose? I said, then we will discuss it until we agree. That is what I should have done 10 days ago when you got the call. I want to do it now. She said nothing for a long moment. She said, okay. I said, good night, Sandra. She said, good night. Thursday morning at 7:15, Sandra texted me a photograph. It was taken from inside the house, looking out the front window. 5 figures on the front lawn in various states of mourning disarray. Loretta in a housecoat and slippers, Linda with a blanket around her shoulders, Robert in a t-shirt and basketball shorts, squinting at something on his phone, Darnell with his arms crossed, looking at the fumigation truck with an expression of profound displeasure, Jalen in a hoodie that was too large for him, holding a bowl of cereal that he had apparently grabbed before the evacuation was complete. Sandra had added one line of text. She said, I hope you are satisfied. I looked at the photograph for a while. I said, how long until the treatment is done? She said, they said noon. I said, I will be there at 1. She said, we need somewhere to go for 4 hours. I said, Sandra, you have a car and a credit card and there are 12 restaurants within 2 miles of the house. This is solvable. She said, fine. I arrived at the house at 1:15. The fumigation company had finished and cleared. The family had been to a diner on Falls of Noose Road for 3 hours and had come back to sit on the porch until the all clear. When I pulled into the driveway, they were on the porch. Loretta looked at me. I said, Mrs. Williams. She said, Richard. I said, I hope the morning was not too inconvenient. She said it was not ideal. I said, I apologize for the timing. We do the annual treatment on a schedule and I had moved it forward. She said, for reasons. I said, yes. She looked at me with the specific expression of a woman who had been managing situations for 60 years and who understood exactly what had happened. She said, my daughter did not tell you we were coming. I said, she told me after the fact. Loretta looked at Sandra, who was standing slightly to the side. Loretta said, Sandra. Sandra said, Mama. Loretta looked back at me. She said that was wrong. She said it plainly. No qualification. She said, a woman should not invite her family into her husband's house without telling him. I said, our house. She said, she should not invite her family into their house without telling her husband. I said, thank you for saying that. She said, I am saying it because it is true, not because I want to leave. I said, I understand. She said, but I am also saying it because you handled this poorly too. I said, explain. She said, a man who has a problem with what is happening in his house should say so directly. Checking into a hotel and scheduling a fumigation is communication of a kind. It is not the best kind. I said, you are right about that. She said, when I came to this house, my daughter told me there was no issue. I believed her because she is my daughter. If I had known there was an issue, I would have handled things differently. I said, what would differently have looked like? She said, I would have had a conversation with you before deciding anything. That is what you do when you are a guest in someone's home. You talk to both people. She said it with the specific directness of a woman who had not reached 67 by being indirect. I said, Mrs. Williams, I want to ask you something directly." She said, "Ask." I said, "How long were you planning to stay?" She said, "Sandra said a month. I was thinking 3 weeks. My knees have been bad and the drive back is difficult." I said, "And Linda and Robert?" Loretta said, "Linda has some things to work through with Robert. She wanted to be near family while they did that." I said, "How long?" She said 2 weeks was what I understood, maybe 10 days. I said, "And Darnell?" Loretta said, "Darnell needed a change of scenery. He is going through something." She said it with the specific maternal protection of someone who was not going to elaborate on what the something was. I said, "And Jalen is here because Darnell is here." She said, "Yes." I said, "Mrs. Williams, I want to propose something." She said, "Propose it." I said, "You stay for 3 weeks as you planned in the guest room. I am going to have that guest room prepared properly for you." She said, "The bedroom was more comfortable." I said, "Mrs. Williams." She said, "The guest room is fine." I said, "Linda and Robert can stay for 10 days in the conditions we discuss. After 10 days, their situation needs to move forward wherever it moves." She said, "That is reasonable." I said, "Darnell and Jalen need a defined arrangement. They can stay for 1 week. At the end of that week, we talk about what makes sense. I am not saying no permanently. I am saying not open-ended." She said, "Darnell will not like that." I said, "Darnell does not have to like it. He has to respect it." She looked at me. She said, "You are not wrong." I said, "And the bedroom is Sandra's and mine. The decorative pillows go back the way they were." Loretta said, "The pillows were impractical." I said, "They were our choice." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "The pillows will go back." She stood from the porch chair. She went inside. I stood on the porch with Sandra. Sandra said, "You talked to my mother like she was a negotiating party." I said, "She is the most senior person in the family. She is also the most reasonable. I wanted to have the conversation with her present rather than around her." Sandra said, "And if she had disagreed with you?" I said, "Then we would have discussed it until we found something workable. That is what this whole week has been about." Sandra said, "You are angry." I said, "I am clear. Those are different things." She said, "What is the difference?" I said, "Anger produces reactions. Clarity produces conversations. I have been trying to have the conversation for 6 years and it has not happened properly. This week was my version of making it happen." She said, "By moving to a hotel." I said, "By removing myself from a situation I had not agreed to until the situation could be renegotiated." She said, "And the fumigation?" I said, "Was the annual fumigation." She said, "Richard." I said, "Sandra." She said, "The timing." I said, "Was deliberate, yes." She looked at me. She said, "That was petty." I said, "It was pointed. There is a difference." She said, "What is the difference this time?" I said, "Petty is about satisfaction. Pointed is about communication. The fumigation communicated that this house has systems that operate regardless of who is in it. That was worth communicating." She stood there for a moment. Then she said, "I should have told you." I said, "Yes." She said, "I knew you would say no." I said, "I might have said no. I might have said yes with conditions. We will never know because you did not give me the chance." She said, "My mother needed somewhere to go." I said, "Your mother needs a lot of things and she always will. That is not going to change. What can change is how we handle it, together." She said, "You want a process." I said, "I want a partnership, which requires both partners to be part of the decisions that affect both partners." She said, "Even for family." I said, "Especially for family, because family decisions carry more emotion and more long-term consequence than most decisions. They require more deliberateness, not less." She was quiet for a while. She said, "What if I had asked you? If I had called you in Atlanta and said my family needs to stay for a month?" I said, "I would have said, let me think about this. And I would have called you back and said your mother can stay for 3 weeks and here is the arrangement for the others and here is what I need in terms of the bedroom and the kitchen and the space." She said, "And I could have said no to the conditions." I said, "And we would have discussed it until we found something that worked. That is what we are doing now, just 4 days late and 1 fumigation into it." She almost smiled. I said, "The pillows though, I need the pillows back." She said, "The pillows are coming back." I went inside. Subscribe to this channel right now. Ring that notification bell, because section 4 is the full 3 weeks and what happened inside them and what changed permanently between Sandra and me by the time Loretta drove home. Loretta Williams stayed for 22 days. She was in the guest room, which we had properly prepared with the better bedside lamp and the extra blankets she preferred, and which she had told Sandra was adequate the morning after the porch conversation, with the specific graciousness of a woman who had made her position clear and was now moving forward. She was good company. This bears saying directly because the story could suggest otherwise. Loretta Williams, as a houseguest operating within an understood arrangement, was genuinely good company. She cooked on Wednesdays. She kept her space tidy. She did not reorganize anything. She watched television at a volume that was her preference and mine simultaneously because we had discovered on the second evening that we both liked it louder than Sandra did. We talked, real conversations, about her life in Richmond, which had been shaped by the same era of American history that my parents' lives had been shaped by in different ways and in a different country, about raising 3 children after her husband left, about what she had wanted for them and what had turned out differently and what she had learned from the difference. She said on the 4th evening, when Sandra had gone to bed early and we were both still in the living room, "You are a patient man." I said, "I have been working on it for 30 years. She said, "My husband was not patient. He was either happy or he was gone. There was no middle." I said, "That is a hard way to live with someone." She said, "It taught my children to manage around the moods, to not say things that might produce the gone." I said, "Instead of saying the things that needed to be said." She said, "Yes." She said, "Sandra does that, you have noticed." I said, "Yes." She said, "She is afraid of the gone." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you going?" I said, "No." She said, "She does not fully believe that yet." I said, "I know that too." She said, "You need to tell her more directly." I said, "How directly?" She said, "Directly enough that she stops managing around you and starts talking to you." I said, "I have been trying." She said, "You have been patient. Patient and direct are different things. Your father teaches patience. Her father left. She needs direct." I sat with that for a while. She said, "You are thinking." I said, "Yes." She said, "I will tell you something else while you think." I said, "Tell me." She said, "I should not have come without a proper arrangement. I knew Sandra had not fully discussed it with you. I suspected, but I convinced myself it was their marriage to manage and my needs to meet." She said, "That was not fair to you." I said, "Mrs. Williams." She said, "Loretta." I said, "Loretta, you have been very gracious about this whole situation." She said, "I have been gracious about the part I was wrong about. I have a right to be comfortable about the parts I was right about." I said, "What were you right about?" She said, "You have a good house. You run it well. My daughter is in a good situation. I came to be part of that for 3 weeks and I should have asked properly." She said, "Darnell should have handled himself better. Linda and Robert need to figure out their own situation without making it yours to host." She said, "And Jalen should not have been in your office." I said, "He set up a very impressive gaming situation in there." She said, he is 16 and he takes up space like he is 40. You do not have to accommodate that. I said, I know. She said, Richard. I said, yes. She said, talk to Sandra, directly, not patiently, not managed. Tell her what you need and what the house needs and what the marriage needs. Let her respond. I said, what if she responds in a way I do not like? She said, then you discuss it. That is marriage. You discuss things until you find the place where you both can stand. She picked up her book. She said, good night. I said, good night, Loretta. Linda and Robert left on day 9. Robert had found a contract opportunity in Charlotte that was real enough to pursue, and the pursuit required him to be in Charlotte. Linda had done the specific work of the 10 days, which was whatever work she needed to do, and she had done it largely in private, and had emerged from the guest room on the last morning with the expression of someone who had resolved something internally. She hugged me at the door. She said, thank you for having us. She said it genuinely. I said, drive safe. Darnell lasted 6 days. He was uncomfortable with defined arrangements in the specific way of a man who had operated without them for long enough that their presence felt like constraint. He did not leave badly. He left quietly on a Tuesday morning with his bags and Jalen beside him, telling Sandra he had found a situation in Greensboro that was going to work out. Sandra asked what the situation was. He said, a thing with a friend. She said, Darnell. He said, I am fine, Sandra, I am fine. He hugged her for a long time. He shook my hand. He said, your house is clean, man. I said, I try. He said, I mean the energy. It is clean. You know what you are doing in here. I said, come back sometime with more notice. He said, yeah. He put his arm around Jalen's shoulder, and they went to the car. Loretta watched from the porch. She did not say anything. The conversation with Sandra happened on day 14. Loretta was in the guest room with her book. The house was quieter than it had been since I got back from Atlanta. Sandra and I were in the kitchen after dinner. I said, I want to have the conversation we have been circling for a week. She said, okay. I said, not about your family specifically, about how we make decisions. She said, okay. I said, you made a decision about our house without telling me. I want to understand why. She said, I told you. I thought it was better in person. I said, Sandra, that is not the real answer. She looked at the table. I said, Loretta told me something. She said you are afraid of the gone. Sandra looked up. I said, she meant that the way you learned to manage your father's moods was by not saying things that might make him leave, and that you do the same thing with me. You manage around what I might say rather than saying what you need to say. She was very still. I said, I want to tell you something directly. I am not going anywhere. I have never been going anywhere. The hotel was not a departure. It was a conversation tool that I used badly and that I should not have needed to use. What I should have done was come home from Atlanta and say this is not okay and this is what needs to change. She said, you would have said no. I said, I might have said no to the open-ended arrangement. I would not have said no to a real conversation about what your family needed and how we could address it in a way that worked for both of us. She said, you and my family have a history. I said, we have a history of me feeling excluded from decisions about my house. That is what we have a history of. She said, I know. I said, I want to change that, but changing it requires you to include me in the decisions even when you are afraid I will say no. She said, what if you say no? I said, then I explain why and we discuss it and we find something that works. Sandra, no is a position in a negotiation. It is not a wall. I have said no to things in this marriage and we have found our way through them. The problem is not the no. The problem is that you are protecting me from the conversation because you are afraid of something that is not actually there. She said, you went to a hotel. I said, because I needed to demonstrate that I was not going to absorb an arrangement I had not agreed to. That was the wrong tool, but it was the only tool I had available at that moment because the right tools had not been used for 6 years. She said, I should have called you from Atlanta. I said, yes. She said, I knew it was wrong and I did not call. I said, yes. She said, because I knew you would say no and I wanted them to come. I said, I understand that, and I want you to hear this. Wanting them to come is completely legitimate. That is your family and you love them and having them near you matters. What is not legitimate is making that happen without telling me. She said, those are two separate things. I said, yes, the want is yours. The decision affects both of us. She said, how do I tell the difference? I said, when the want requires someone else to accommodate it, that is when the conversation happens. She was quiet for a while. She said, I am going to say something difficult. I said, say it. She said, I have been managing you the same way I managed my father because I never really believed you were different from him. She said it quietly and directly, and it cost her something to say. I said, I know. She said, that is not fair to you. I said, no, it is not. She said, I want to try to do it differently. I said, I know you do, and I want to say something in return. She said, okay. I said, I have been patient instead of direct. Loretta pointed that out. I accommodated the creep for 6 years without having the full conversation because I told myself I was being patient and reasonable and that it would resolve itself. It did not resolve itself. It produced a week in a hotel and a fumigation. She said the fumigation was not subtle. I said no, it was pointed, which is what I should have been years ago. She said, what does being pointed look like going forward? I said, it looks like saying directly when something is not working, before it compounds, before I need a hotel and a fumigation company to make the statement. She said, and what do I do when you say that thing directly? I said you respond directly, not managed, the real response, and we discuss it. She said, what if my real response is that I need my family here? I said, then we discuss what that looks like in a way that works for both of us, and we arrive at something together. She said, together. I said, that is the whole word. She was quiet for a while. She said, Mama likes you. I said, I like her. She said, she told me you were direct with her on the porch. I said I was. She said that was right. I said, she also told me I was wrong for the hotel. She said, she told me I was wrong for not calling you. I said, she is a fair woman. She said, she is the fairest person I know. She said, Richard. I said, yes. She said, I am sorry for what I did. I said, I know, I accept that. She said, genuinely. I said, I know. She said, and I want to be different about this going forward. I said, I want that too. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. She said, the pillows are back, by the way. I said, I noticed. She said, they are impractical. I said, they are ours. She said, yes, they are. Loretta left on a Sunday. Sandra and I both drove her to the point where she insisted we stop. She said, I can manage from here, go home. We hugged in the parking lot of a gas station in Henderson, North Carolina. She held Sandra for a long time. She said something in Sandra's ear that I did not hear. Then she hugged me. She said, you are a good man, Richard. I said, thank you for the conversation on the 4th night. She said, I told you what I saw. What you did with it was yours. She said, my daughter is lucky. I said, I am luckier. She said, that is the right answer. She got in her car. She drove south. We drove back to Raleigh. The thing that changed in the following months was not dramatic. It was not a single event or a single conversation. It was a series of smaller things that built in a direction. Sandra called me from work one afternoon in October. She said, "My mother is asking about Thanksgiving." I said, "What is she thinking?" She said she wants to come here. Linda and Robert too, probably. Maybe Darnell and Jalen. I said, "Okay." She said, "Okay, meaning?" I said, "Meaning let's talk about what that looks like." She said, "You are not saying no." I said, "I am saying let's discuss the arrangement." She said, "That is different." I said, "Yes." We discussed the arrangement. It took 2 phone calls and 1 evening conversation. We landed on Loretta for 5 days, Linda and Robert for 3 days, arriving and leaving on different days so the guest room was not double booked, Darnell and Jalen for 3 days, if Darnell confirmed 2 weeks in advance so we could plan correctly. Sandra called Loretta with the arrangement. Loretta said, "That is very organized." Sandra said, "We worked it out together." Loretta said, "Good." Thanksgiving happened. It was the best holiday we had had in 6 years of marriage. Not because everyone behaved perfectly, because everyone knew what the arrangement was and operated within it, and the operating within it produced a specific kind of relaxation that an undefined arrangement never produced. Loretta cooked on Thursday. I handled Friday. Sandra made dessert. Robert fixed the deck board that Marcus had fixed improperly a few years back and was coming loose again. Jalen asked if he could use the home office to work on a school project and asked me directly, looking me in the eye, and I said yes, and when he left he had cleaned up after himself. Sandra said afterward, "What happened to Jalen?" I said Darnell talked to him after the summer. She said, "What did Darnell say?" I said, "I do not know specifically, but Jalen asked before he used the office and cleaned up after himself. Whatever Darnell said, it worked." She said, "Darnell is better than he seems." I said, "I know. He needs structure the same way Jalen does. When there is structure, he is better." She said, "Like everyone." I said, "Like everyone." She said, "Including us." I said, "Especially us." Here is what this story is about. It is not about the fumigation. The fumigation is the part everyone laughs at, and it deserves a laugh. 5 people in pajamas on a front lawn because the annual treatment was moved forward by a week is genuinely funny. I have told this story twice at dinners, and both times the pajama detail produced the specific response that a good story detail should produce. But the fumigation was a symptom. The actual story was about a marriage that had an arrangement problem that had been building for 6 years through the specific mechanism of patience, substituting for directness. I had been patient in the way that produced accommodation rather than conversation. Every time I said nothing about a visit that ran long or a space that was taken without asking, I was not being gracious. I was being avoidant. I was choosing not to have the conversation because the conversation had emotional cost and the status quo was manageable. The status quo accumulated. 6 years of manageable became 1 week of unmanageable. And what the hotel and the fumigation and the porch conversation with Loretta and the kitchen table conversation with Sandra produced was the thing that 6 years of patience had not produced. A real arrangement. Not perfect, not rigid, a real one that both of us had made together and that we both operated within. My father worked overnight for 22 years in a job below his training level because the work that was available was the work he did. He never called it suffering. He called it the work while you wait for the work. What I was doing for 6 years was patience while I waited for the conversation. The conversation required me to stop waiting and start speaking. Directly, not patiently, not managed. Directly. Loretta told me that. She was right. She is usually right. She is coming for a week in March. I have the guest room prepared. The bedroom pillows are exactly where Sandra and I put them. The fumigation is already scheduled for next fall. Thank you for being here for this story all the way to the end. Like this video right now if the pajamas on the lawn made you laugh, but also like it if anything in the marriage side of this story said something true. Subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. New story every single week, real ones that go places. Share this with someone who is managing around a conversation they need to have directly. Sometimes the clearest thing you can do for a relationship is stop being patient and start being honest. Comment below. Tell me what you thought I was going to do when I called the fumigation company. And tell me if you have ever had a Loretta in your life who told you the truth you needed to hear.